Before colonization took a hold across the North American territories in the 15th century AD, various tribal civilizations existed across the beautiful continental landscape, from the swamps in the south, to the woodland hills in the east, to the plains in the Midwest, and to the mountains in the central and the deserts in the west. Indigenous folk of a pre-Columbus America dominated the countryside without even a thought of white settlers beckoning to explore their land in the centuries to come. These tribes weren't simply barbaric masses of savages and killers, but rather complex societies featuring thousands of languages and dialects, cultures with passionate obligations, political systems and leadership councils, and religions saturated with spiritualism and mythology. Unfortunately, however, a majority of these customs and beliefs were nearly wiped completely from the history books after the introduction of colonization in America in the 16th century, which saw the number of Native American populations decrease by hundreds of thousands. Only microscopic portions of these tribes make up American demographics in the present day. In order to preserve their histories, cultures, and ways of life, this is the first in a series of brief essays documenting the rich details of Native American tribes, ranging from the First Nations in Canada to the Nativos Mexicanos in Mexico. This is the first story of the Seven Council Fires, colloquially known as the Sioux. With roots in America dating back to 100 to 400 AD, the Sioux were and still are one of the largest nations of Indigenous Americans in all of history. Members of the Sioux themselves call themselves the Great Sioux Nation, translated to Seven Council Fires in English. The fires represent the seven Oyate, translated to nations or peoples. Presently, these nations include the Teton or Lakota, a collective of 4 tribes called the Santee or Eastern Dakota, and the collective of 2 tribes called the Yangtun or Western Dakota. Most modern-day non-native scholars refer to these nations simply as the Lakota or Dakota, all dependent on the intricate dialect changes between specific tribes. These languages are called the Siouan Catawba and were spoken by various tribes ranging from the modern-day Carolinas up into Western Canada. One of the few dialect similarities throughout all tribes are the words Lakota and Dakota, which translates to ally when spoken by different members of different nations to one another. In the 1760s, French colonizers attributed the word Sioux to the Seven Council Fires, an abbreviation of the French word Nadasou, attributed to the native tribes by a colonist of the name Jean Nicolet in 1640. The word is a combination of the Ojibwe word for little snake, Nadawesi, and an incorrectly used suffix by French colonizers, "u." Today, the people of Seven Council Fires are referred to in Ojibwe as Bwane, translated to roasters in English, most likely affiliated with the means of cooking used by the tribes of yesteryear. Other modern-day nations have legally changed their colonial names back to traditional names, whereas some have foregone the legal system in total and reject the usage of Romance language-derived names in general. In terms of traditional structures of society seen in various tribes, the Seven Council Fires feature a unique combination of family ties, natural connection, and both earthly and cosmic spiritualism. Many of the villages held what the English call camp circles, ceremonies promoting kinship and community, and members considered themselves a large extended family consisting of smaller immediate families. No 2 camp circles were alike either, and all ceremonies were guided by an appointed leader chosen by a council filled with elder statesmen from the tribe. The vitality of kinship was not limited to camp circles and family dynamics, however. Proper kinship was a requirement of all tribal members, extending from childhood to elderhood. This included being a proper relative, friend, and leader. It also included all living subjects on Earth, as well as all parts of the natural world. To put something before kinship, such as material riches or personal glory, would be to go against the strongest values each tribe maintained. These ideals carried over even into other eras of colonization. Members of the Seven Council Fires were not obstinate to trade with white settlers for no reason. Rather, they carried a deeply spiritual requirement to form a bond with all whom they traded with, including their invaders. Some early colonists fell in line with these indigenous customs and fostered such special bonds with tribal members, and they were adopted into the band as outsiders. Of course, these instances were few and far between, as most of the colonists were too stubborn or impatient to form social bonds with any Native American, regardless of tribe, and falsely attributed the customs to ego, pride, and narcissism. There was also a tightly woven system of religions within the Seven Council Fires, as well. The overarching belief was that the cosmos and everything in it was created by a being called the Great Spirit or the Great Mystery, when translated to English. The symbol of these beliefs came in the form of a sacred hoop, as English translations have it, also called medicine circles in other various indigenous dialects. The visual is meant to invoke the sense of oneness throughout the universe, all held together by the Great Spirit. This included the concept of all things, the trees and the hillsides, to the lakes and the riverbeds, to the birds and various creatures crawling across the planet, were all equal in spirit, but still below the status of the Great Mystery. Connecting tribal members to the spirits on the ground and in the sky was a type of prayer, and it translated to claiming a relationship with when spoken in English. In the Lakota nations, a prophet called White Buffalo Calf Woman was sent to Earth to act as a medium between the Great Spirit and the human race. Through this relationship, the prophet taught humans how to establish proper kinship and be a great member of the family through a series of ceremonies called the Seven Sacred Rites. These rites ranged from purification, to a sun dance, to vision quests, to female puberty celebrations. All 7 rites were then confirmed via the smoking of a sacred pipe, in which all elements of the ritual represented the elements of Earth and the connections between them and humankind. Dreams are also incredibly important tools used by the Seven Council Fires to establish their connections with the spiritual world and enhance their abilities on an earthly realm. One such example was the instruction that dreaming of thunder beings, when translated to English, would turn the dreamer into a sacred jester, who would then share their supernatural power with all who encountered them and their comedic performances. Funeral practices were also hugely symbolic and spiritual rites performed by tribal members all throughout their history. Traditionally, tribes would honor the deceased with a 4-day wake in which all members of the band mourned and guided the dead spirit into the earthly resting place. Tribal members would also put the corpse of the deceased on a burial scaffold, either in the trees or on a vertical pole to keep the body off the ground. The body would remain there for a year, with offerings put on the head and cloth wrapped around the rest. The deceased were not strayed away from or kept private, however. Tribes would continue to speak to the bodies of the dead, even offering them food or drink. This was all part of the process of guiding the deceased along its spiritual journey and allowing the rest of the tribe to properly mourn, whilst also gaining newfound connections with the spiritual realm. Of course, no tribe of the Seven Council Fires was complete without an assortment of musical styles permeating around villages and campsites. Various tribes amongst the Dakota bands utilized a call-and-response style of song and dance, led by a solo vocalist who starts singing in a high pitch before transitioning to a specific phrase. The rest of the group then repeats this phrase, continuing to lower their pitch before stopping altogether with an effective pause. In the second half of the arrangement, performers will create sounds called honor beats. Honor beats usually consisted of 4 steady beats, symbolizing the low-frequency sounds of war, impending conflict, and later the sound of cannon fire after the colonization of America by Europeans brought over artillery-based warfare. The Dakota tribes also utilized percussion in their song and dance rituals. These bands especially practiced syncopation, which is the rhythmic beating of drums or other percussive surfaces to form an entire song. This could either be offbeat drumming, synchronized drumming, or most often a combination of the two. Some bands within the same tribe would engage in competitive musicianship, with songs that evolved from non-pattern ruffles to a patterned, fast-paced beat. In all Dakota-based tribal events, nothing could start until the Dakota flag song is played. This custom includes no dance, but is a pillar of powwows and celebrations of the warriors amongst each tribe. Across all musician customs of the Seven Council Fires, lyrical songs were few and far between, with most music only using syllabic sounds, vocables, and guttural noises without a translation. Sometimes, lyrics would be included, but only in the second half of performances. Women were also heavily utilized in song and dance rituals, normally singing at a higher pitch and carrying musical performances the second and third time through the song, or as many times as the piece is repeated. Every summer, these types of large communal performances were key pieces of the main assembly of all leaders across all 7 tribes, where tribal figures came together to restore their kinship values and deliberate on tribal ordeals. At the summer festivities, 4 main tribal leaders were appointed by the heads of each band in the tribes, depending on the nominee's intelligence, compassion, courage, and resiliency. This was the highest honor bestowed upon the 7 council fires, and one was only chosen if the rest of the leadership believed this member to be able to carry on all of the tribe's traditions and maintain their desired day-to-day lives. Responsibilities of the 4 leaders included making decisions on replotting camps and villages, navigating conflict between neighboring tribes, and planning large-scale tribal hunts. Below this sub-leadership were collections of fraternities of men, split into 2 factions of younger males and older males. Each faction had their own responsibilities, and the former leaders and various elders in the older age group helped guide their youthful counterparts. 7 council fires also included entire societies of warrior bands, who were tasked with leading hunts, training for battle, and providing security to the rest of the village or community. Alongside these warrior arms were 2 elected voices of the communities, called shirt-wearers when translated to English. Shirt-wearers were master communicators and peer mediators, tasked with settling disputes both within tribal bands and with foreign parties, such as the colonizers in the 16th century. Almost all shirt-wearers were men, and had to display qualities of future leadership whilst also coming from a bloodline of former leaders as well. Ranked right below the shirt-wearers were pipe holders. Pipe holders were vital to ceremonial rituals seen across tribes, as they guided peace talks within the ceremonies and made sure everyone involved had exactly what they needed. Pipe holders also helped the top leaders select potential campsites and village movement, as well as watching over the warrior bands whenever they would venture out on buffalo hunts. Men weren't the only ones with responsibilities, however. While there were defined gender roles across the 7 council fires, like many traditional Eastern cultures, women didn't do chores around the house. They did help make cloth and weave fabric, but they also were considered owners of the houses themselves, responsible for all decisions pertaining to a residence. Men and women also were not restricted to certain sexual preferences or intimate relationships either. Even gender itself was seen as a fluid identity, and tribal members assigned male at birth would sometimes take on the duties of those assigned female at birth, and vice versa, without judgment or scorn being passed on by elders or other members of a tribe. Overall, the 7 council fires saw themselves as a unique yet fundamental piece to the planet's ecosystem, whilst understanding the bond we form with each other and every other living thing on Earth is vital to a fulfilling and proper life. The ancestors of modern-day 7 council fires are first thought to have arrived in what is present-day northwestern Wisconsin and central Minnesota, back around 800 AD. They came from the central Mississippi River Valley, living there for at least a couple of millennia. These indigenous bands are now called the Woodland Blackduck Kathio Clam River Continuum by English historians of modern age. The continuum didn't acquire the cultures and customs seen in northern tribal communities until 1300 AD, of which they acquired from fellow tribes in the region. It was around this time that the period of the continuum officially became the period of 7 council fires. Over the next 300 years, the 7 council fires developed into what we best consider the Sioux Native American branch as they were met by European colonists in the 16th and 17th centuries. That is until the 1650s, when the area once inhabited by the 7 council fires around the source of the Mississippi River and the Great Lakes region in general was under a claims dispute by the Iroquois tribe of the First Nations. The Iroquois were longtime rivals to the 7 council fires, and the 2 tribes engaged in elongated warfare just as the fur traders from Europe arrived. Thus, by 1659, the Dakota tribes moved west into Wisconsin and Minnesota, and by 1700, nearly all tribal members called this region their home. Meanwhile, the Lakota tribes started pushing their villages westward into the Great Plains, and most of the 7 council fires ended up with them. With the westward expansion of indigenous folks, however, came along the westward expansion of colonists and pioneers currently colonizing America. These white settlers, of course, mingled with the Seven Council Fires in both the East and Northern Midwest territories, and introduced the horses to the tribes by the 18th century. Despite the acquisitions of horses and newfound approach to transportation, the Dakota tribes in present-day Wisconsin and Minnesota were unable to hold their eastward borders due to the constant encroachment of the Iroquois and other intertribal contestants. The Seven Council Fires also started dealing with massive outbreaks of smallpox and malaria due to the arrival of colonists, and saw their numbers deteriorate by over 30% by 1805, and the tribes still occupying the Great Lakes regions. Around the same time, the surviving Dakota tribes to the north and the Lakota tribes to the east began fur trading with the French. These practices date back into the 17th century when the Iroquois first pushed the Seven Council Fires west. While the relationships the Lakota and Dakota built with the French were mostly docile, as long as the colonizers understood the vitality and importance of kinship, their history of trading wasn't without conflict. Seven Council Fires had more than a few conflicts with other tribes around the territories, and those rival tribes saw the French's involvement with the Sioux as encroachment on their peace. These tribes included the Ojibwe, the Cree, and the Meskwaki. After the turn of the 19th century, as the Seven Council Fires remnants pushed further into the Great Plains regions of America, they began to adopt customs and traits of the indigenous groups that had once called the Plains their homes for years. By 1803, the three major bands of the Western Dakota, Eastern Dakota, and Lakota were all incredibly distinct in their practices and customs, but still held their sacred bond of kinship, which kept the tribes connected well beyond their geographical developments. Unfortunately, it was around this time that the Seven Council Fires truly began to feel the disastrous effects colonization has on their lands and on their people. In 1825, they were forced into the Treaty of Prairie du Chien with 7 other indigenous tribes in an effort to stop intertribal warfare, all for the sake of the settlers. Then, 5 years later, they were forced into another treaty of the same name in 1830, in which the Lakota had to give up their lands found near the Des Moines River to the United States government. In 1849, with the birth of the Minnesota Territory, more Sioux lands were forcibly taken by the American leadership after they entered various contracts ensuring the tribes millions of US dollars after they had sold 21 million acres for $1.6 million. Yet in an unsurprising twist, nearly 80% of this money was kept by the American government, and more lands were stolen without proper notice. By 1858, the first ever Seven Council Fires reservation was created in Charles Mix County of present-day South Dakota. The reservation consists of less than only 37,000 acres, but it was the event that led to various tribal leaders across all Seven Council Fires to speak out against the colonizers and affirm the desire to defend their homeland and fight back. The fighting truly began in 1862 with the Dakota War, stemming from the starved tribes whose nomadic hunting efforts were completely thwarted by white settlers. The colonizers wanted the tribes to hunt more like Europeans and settle down as farmers, but the Seven Council Fires saw this as a threat to their way of life and resisted. The conflict lasted all the way until December 26, 1862, when 38 members of the Dakota tribe were lynched in Mankato under the guise of the United States government, and the remaining tribal members were pushed out of Minnesota for good. The remaining Dakota bands split off to the reservations popping up throughout the North Dakota regions, South Dakota regions, Great Plains regions, or they moved west with the migrated Lakota branch. The Lakota had already entered a land agreement with the U.S. government in 1851 with the Fort Laramie Treaty. The contract was between 9 separate indigenous tribes who all agreed to stop intertribal conflict and allow for the safe passage of white settlers who were at that point engaging with the wagon trails and migrating to Oregon Territory. However, that treaty was swiftly broken just as quickly as it had been agreed to. The Lakota engaged in multiple scuffles with the Crow tribes, and with the uncontrolled influx of unruly settlers in the late 1850s as a result of Pikes Peak Gold Rush in Colorado, indigenous affairs quickly grew intolerable to their new neighbors. Another similar treaty to Fort Laramie was attempted a few years later in 1868, but again did little to mitigate the intertribal warfare as the Americans' systematic destruction of the American buffalo, which was the basic food and clothing source for most indigenous tribes in the western United States, ravaged the Seven Council Fires with famine, fatigue, and inflamed frustrations. When the Black Hills Gold Rush saw an influx of colonists settle along the northern Great Plains of modern-day South Dakota and Wyoming, the 1868 treaty was all but rendered dead. Once George Armstrong Custer brought an expansive expedition force into the area in 1874 and disrespected the indigenous bands already living in the area, the Seven Council Fires and neighboring northern Chippewa tribes had enough, and the Great Sioux War was underway in 2 short years in 1876. The Great Sioux War of 1876 was prefaced with various raids and smaller conflicts between the Seven Council Fires and both settlers and opposing tribes since the 1850s. Many of the battles were over the effects from the buffalo extinctions and land disputes, comprising the generalized Sioux Wars from 1850 to 1890. These conflicts ranged from the Dakota War of 1862 and Red Cloud's War to the Black Hills War and the Battle of the Little Bighorn from 1876 to 1877. The Great Sioux War of 1876 was specifically about the U.S. government's lackadaisical approach to keeping settlers out of the Black Hills, which had belonged to the 2 tribes claiming it for hundreds of years. The United States went to war led by the aforementioned Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, whereas the Chippewa, Arapaho, and Seven Council Fires were led by Crazy Horse, Chief Gall, and Sitting Bull. Throughout the conflict, the United States Army systematically sectioned off vital resources to the indigenous tribes in each swath of land they claimed. Eventually, the tribes were without choice but to make one final push. The final conflict of the 40-year series of wars is colloquially known as the Wounded Knee Massacre on December 29, 1890. The name is derived from the nearby Wounded Knee Creek on the Lakota Pine Ridge Native American Reservation, where almost 150 men, women, and children of a Lakota tribe were mercilessly slaughtered by the U.S. Army. Another 150 Lakota tribesmen escaped from the ordeal and fled into the countryside. However, it being the onset of winter, most of, if not all of the fleeing members died of hypothermia and other natural elements due to the incoming blizzard. The massacre at Wounded Knee was seen as a pivotal point in the Seven Council Fires' history. From this point forward, all tribes were subject to the assimilation of Native Americans into the colonized United States. The assimilation era was marked with various reservations and boarding schools being erected so that the tribal members would still have a stake to claim on their homeland. However, as is seen across all histories of all tribes to the First Nations and Indigenous Americans, these reservations were marked with inhumane conditions, and the boarding schools were simply vessels of cultural and spiritual deconstruction. Children were forced to adapt to Christian principles and European traditions, which eventually became American traditions, as the rest of the country was colonized and all tribal nations across the continent were subjected to partial, if any, sovereignty. These methods of assimilation lasted all the way into the 1980s, when efforts for self-determination swirled through the remaining community members considered members of the Seven Council Fires. In modern times, the Seven Council Fires have focused on reclaiming sovereignty in their lands. In 1980, they were awarded $100 million in reparations for the theft of the Black Hills region in the 1870s. However, the tribe has since refused as there is no monetary comparison for their ancestors' home. The deal is currently worth upwards of $1 billion in reparations, with zero expectation that they will ever be collected. There's also the present-day issue of the Dakota Access Oil Pipeline. In 2016, a group of Seven Council Fires members successfully protested the drilling of the Bakken pipeline of the Bakken oil fields, which are found on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. The pipeline would have introduced a bevy of environmental issues, such as toxifying drinking water and destroying the little cultural relationship the tribal members maintained with the earth. As of today, the pipeline is still under construction despite these protests and the written solidarity of 87 other tribal leaders who also reject the project's premise. All in all, the total population of the Seven Council Fires sits at just 170,000 as of the 2010 census, just a fraction of the numbers the tribe saw 200 plus years ago. Significant populations currently reside in both North and South Dakota, Minnesota, Nebraska, Montana, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Wyoming, as well as the Manitoba and Saskatchewan provinces in Canada. It's easy to think of the Sioux and only attribute them to the conflicts along the American frontier during the Wild West's heyday in the mid to late 19th century. But it's important to remember their histories and cultures date back centuries before. Instead, think of the Seven Council Fires as a network of close-knit communities bonded to each other and to the natural world around them through a dedicated focus on kinship. Think of them as environmentalists dedicating their lives to enhancing humankind's relationship with Earth. Think of them as expert buffalo hunters and agile warriors. Think of them as dreamers and spiritualists, as musicians and storytellers, with a deep-rooted love in friendship, family, and humanity. This is the story of the Seven Council Fires.